Welcome to our panel on building better teams to build better UX. So as you can see, I'm joined by three lovely folks up here. And I just want to start off with introductions. I'm Kimberly Blessing. I'm the head of technology at Think Company. We're a user experience design and development consulting firm here in Philadelphia. And though I work for a smaller company now, I have about 15 years of experience working in the enterprise at companies like Comcast, PayPal, and AOL. I'm going to hand it off to Steve, and then each person here is going to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to start asking some questions so we can start talking about how to get to better UX by building better teams.
So I'm Steve Smith. I'm the mobile practice lead for Chariot Solutions. So Chariot Solutions, besides organizing this conference, we're actually a consulting firm, software consultants. So in my role, I kind of do two things. I focus on the business side, helping to grow the mobile practice from a business perspective, so supporting sales, marketing, things like that. And I'm also a consultant, so I go out and actually do the work. So I've been a consultant since the mid to late 90s, started with Java backend stuff. Then I joined Chariot like 13 years ago, so about 9 years ago, got involved in mobile, been doing that ever since. So at Chariot, we primarily focus on native development, but we do also get involved in some hybrid, some mobile web, but primarily Android, iOS type development.
My name is Pete Fleming. I am a product designer, currently working for AT&T, working on a home mesh Wi-Fi brand new product for AT&T. I started my journey in the digital world, making websites in my attic back in the late 90s. Moved into an agency in the early 2000s, a little boutique startup design interactive agency here in the Philadelphia area. When I started there, I was employee number 2. So it was very much startup. I wore a lot of hats. I did design, which back then meant you did visual design, and did some coding myself, HTML, CSS, and a little bit of PHP, MySQL type stuff. As the agency grew, I focused more on the design side than the development side, and I also grew out the user experience department within the agency. I left there about 4 or 5 years ago, went out on my own to be a consultant because I wanted to get more on the product side. So I wanted to get much more of the user-centered design, and I wanted to be more involved on the product side as opposed to the agency, just to get, just so I felt like I had a little bit more ownership with the stuff I was building and not just making pretty things and putting them in boxes and putting bows on them and handing them over. So that's where I'm at now. So I'm doing product design, and I'm kind of transitioning also from a designer to being more on the product or business side of it as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Moll. I run a design collaborative called Super Friendly here in Philadelphia. Prior to that, I grew up in design. I went to design school. I worked at design agencies and ad agencies running design teams and interactive teams. I helped to start a web design boutique here in Philly called HappyCog. Was the interactive director there for a few years. Then moved to Brooklyn and ran the design team at an agency called Big Spaceship for a while. And a lot of what I do now is building teams and trying to get the right people in the room and the right people on the projects to do excellent work.
Super. So thanks, everybody. I just want to give a little bit of context. Anybody who signed up for Philly ETE during the early bird phase may have seen a different talk listed here. The original title for this talk was Designers and Developers, Why Can't We All Get Along? That was actually the talk title that was proposed by one of the conference organizers who was looking essentially to put together a panel of designers and devs to get together and talk about how does bad UX go out in the wild so often? Why is it that we can't all get along and create great products? And when they approached me to moderate this panel, I sort of said, what are you talking about? Designers and developers get along just fine. The problem is more with other things. And so we changed the title of this talk to focus really more on what needs to happen to build stronger teams in order to make sure that you get that great user experience at the very end. So let's just first start off by addressing that former elephant that was in the room. And do designers and developers really not get along? So Steve's going to start us off.
He had the mic. So we do get along. I mean, basically, the way I see it is it's really about people first. So it's important that you hire the right people that are qualified and willing to communicate, and not just communicate to others, but listen to what others have to say. So that's kind of the first step in it for me. And then, of course, the company culture and processes have to support that collaboration. Otherwise, they won't get along. I've been in environments where one happens, so the environment is very collaborative, but the people aren't, and that doesn't work. And I've been in the opposite as well. So for me, it's about those three things.
No, they don't get along.
I was going to say maybe.
Oh, we should have worked something out ahead of time. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what I'm thinking is what Steve just said there. I have been in places where they didn't get along, but I don't blame that on their disciplines. You know, I don't say it's because they're designers and developers or engineers that they don't get along. It's other things, and I'll probably be reiterating a lot of what Steve said. But one is personalities. You can have, as I'm sure you guys know, you can have one bad seed. You know, one bad person can poison a whole organization, and it doesn't matter which side they're on. But you know, if they're all about, you know, covering their ass, or you know, making sure that they come out shining bright, or making sure that, you know, all blame gets deflected off their discipline, whether it be the developers or the designers, that infects the whole side. And then once one side is infected, then the other side has to play defensive. So it's individuals, but it's also a lot about the company structure, the hierarchy. I mean, if you just stop and think about it for a second, think about companies you've worked for, and who does the design team report to? In companies where the design team reports to the business side, you'll see typically more tension between designers and developers. I've been in organizations where the design team reported to technology, in which case those two tended to get along, and it was them against the business people. So a lot of it is individual personality, and another piece of it is the structure of the organization or the culture.
So we got a yes, a no, and a maybe. I'll do maybe. I think that I think that the phrase "do designers and developers get along" I think is confused for another phrase, because I think the meaning behind that, when people often ask that, is do they work well together? And those are different questions. So you can be polite, you can get along, but that doesn't mean that you work well together. So I think I've seen a lot of polite teams fall apart because politeness is not what gets collaboration done. And that's not to say that in order to be collaborative you have to be impolite, but it's that when people are polite to each other, they tend to not engage because they don't want to step on each other's toes. And so what I've found is that, in my experience, teams that engage with each other, developers and designers that aren't afraid to kind of get in each other's stuff, still can be politely, but aren't afraid of stepping on each other's toes, they tend to work better together because they're not afraid of, because they're not so far apart. When I think about projects that have fallen apart, projects that I've been part of, it's where the teams don't engage each other and the people on the teams don't engage each other, so there's a lot of distance between the job roles, and that's where things fall through the cracks. There's this wide chasm between what happens in design and what happens in development, and that's where things fall apart, because people start to go, I thought you were going to do, oh, I was supposed to do that? Oh, and then it just gets lost. So I think that designers and developers get along fine if they're nice people, but it doesn't mean that good work always happens there.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. And just building on what Dan said, and this extends beyond just designers and developers. This can extend to QA. This can extend to the product owner and other folks in the business, and other roles that may play a part in creating a software product or physical product. There has to be that healthy engagement and collaboration, but that acceptance that things are going to get messy. Things may get heated. There's going to be constructive criticism. People are going to need to learn how to process feedback and find ways of, really having difficult conversations with one another. And it sometimes takes a leader, and that doesn't mean a manager necessarily, but somebody even within the team can step up and be that leader and create a safe space for those interactions to happen so that people walk away feeling like, yeah, okay, I feel like I was heard. I feel like my input was accepted. Yeah, like it took us a while to get there, but I think we've got a great product at the end. So I'm kind of jumping ahead because if we accept the premise that designers and developers can and do get along and work well together, what causes bad user experience to ship? So I'm going to start with Pete on this one.
What causes bad user experience to ship? So we could do a whole hour on this, I'm sure, right? There's a lot of reasons why bad stuff gets out there. There's poor leadership. Maybe your leaders don't have a strong compass, or strong principles to guide by. Poor processes are in place. Not enough, I'm a designer, so I'm going to say not enough user contact, not enough user influence in the process. But generally speaking, from what I've seen, the three main things that cause crap to make it to the world is too much planning, or the planning tries to get too much into the minutia of what the product has to be. This is especially true in big companies like the one that I'm consulting for right now. They have these 18-month roadmaps where they're trying to get every little detail, every little button that has to be in the UI or in the product has to have a requirement written for it. So too much of that done up front. Not enough user exposure, right? And user exposure is important for designers, but I strongly believe that it's important for everybody in the company. Developers, QA, the leadership, product people, everybody has to have some amount of exposure to the end user. The amount of context you can get from just an hour or two a month in front of users is huge. And then the third thing is the building of the product. So when you build stuff, I see too many organizations that are tied to all that stuff that was planned 18 months ahead of time. Oh, we have to build it because we got a bunch of smart people in a room and they wrote these requirements, so that's the way it's got to be. Regardless of the fact is the winds have changed and the product is different and users want different things now. But to try to get a change in a product, or in the roadmap at that point in time is really hard because you have to go back to the 50 people who signed off on that to try to get them to sign off on your new way of doing it. So those are the three sort of main things from my point of view.
Dan next.
I don't disagree with any of that stuff, so I'll take a slightly different angle. I think that bad user experiences ship all the time, and I think a lot of times that's okay. I think it's not okay when bad user experiences accidentally ship. So I think that it's fine to launch something because you don't know what it's going to be, or you don't know how people are going to use it. I think that's actually a good user experience, learning from bad user experience. But I think when something goes out the door that people go, oh, we didn't even realize that didn't work, it's because somebody wasn't paying attention. So accidents happen when people don't pay attention. So when something goes out the door and a manager or a user or someone or a stakeholder says, well, the checkout flow doesn't work, it's because everybody's pointing fingers and going, well, I thought that was your job and you thought that was my job, and it's because somebody wasn't paying attention to it. So I think that one of the ways to solve that is to actually increase some redundancy around that. So rather than it being one person's job to test a thing or validate a thing, let it be everybody's job or two people's job. And it's okay if two people are responsible for testing a thing, because it just means you get double coverage there. I think it's when people go, oh, that's not my job, and when they operate in silos and go, oh, that's somebody else is going to take care of that, is when bad user experiences accidentally ship, and it's not an intention of the product team to actually ship it that way.
Being the only developer up here, I'm going to blame these guys when bad UX ships. No, seriously, I'll go back. I mean, I agree with what these guys say, but I'll kind of also go back to the people. It starts with hiring good people. If you have good quality people, that's going to help limit that factor. I also agree a lot with the whole user testing. Like get whatever you're building, whether it be an app, a website, whatever, get some kind of beta testers or some kind of user group that can get their hands on it early and often to get that feedback, because otherwise you're kind of doing it with a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions don't always come true. We've seen it with other clients where they build a whole thing, all of a sudden it gets in the client's hand and they're like, what? We didn't want this, we can't use this. So I think that's an important part of it as well.
I'm going to jump in on this one because I think there were a couple of things that we talked about that didn't quite come up.
Because they know exactly what I'm talking about.
So, and actually I'm going to put this in the context of something that we say frequently at Thing Company. There's no, and so I'm a technologist, former developer, saying there's no I in design. This is something that our designers say all the time. There is an I in design, but our designers frequently have to educate the stakeholders that we work with to coach them away from wanting to see their vision realized and helping them accept that when there is research being done, when there is real user feedback coming in, that's the voice of the customer. That is the voice of the end user. That is ultimately what matters, not CEO or chief design officer or product owner who wants something to be exactly what they envision it as being. So there has to be a certain amount of flexibility ultimately amongst the entire team, and I think that cascades all the way down to the level of designers and developers. And in my experience as a developer, helping the designer recognize where there might be failure paths that they haven't anticipated and ensuring that they're part of the process of creating those workflows just as much as they've been part of creating the ideal state. So, you know, if there is a chance of somebody getting bounced out of the application, making sure that there's clear language to explain that rather than just me deciding to return whatever, you know, the stack trace was to the screen, which is going to confuse whoever is looking at it. So it's got to be that two-way street, and everybody's got to kind of be part of making the product. And maybe we'll just switch the order and just stick with whoever last has the mic. So we want to talk about how do we build better teams. So what activities do you recommend to help designers and developers build stronger relationships?
So I guess anything that kind of promotes communication, collaboration. So whether that be going out, lunches, happy hours, kind of social things, or whether that just be the team getting together on some kind of regular basis to communicate about either features that are upcoming, what are the thoughts for it, you know, how that might be approached. So anything, you know, that really involves getting the team communicating, getting the team comfortable with what each person has to offer to the end product. That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, co-location is huge, especially in Agile environments, getting the teams to sit together as teams as opposed to disciplines. You know, some people write that off and say it's not that important, but I think it's absolutely huge. It's something that I'm feeling actually right now, because the project that I'm working on, there's a small team of us, designers and product people here in Philadelphia, but the majority of our team, the other 150 people inside this organization, are all in Atlanta. So we're having to find very creative ways to sort of bridge that co-location gap. I'm flying down there quite often as part of it, but that's, you know, that's not I have a wife and 3 kids, that's not a long-term solution. So, you know, using things like real-time board, which is like an online whiteboard collaboration space, and we use the heck out of Slack and things like that. Finding ways that we can keep, you know, little conversations, trying to bring that sort of hallway conversation or water cooler conversation and get that in the digital world, because that's huge. And the other thing I always recommend is thinking on the walls. Any of these guys that have ever worked with me know that I take over whole walls, sometimes whole rooms or whole buildings. I'm always taping stuff to walls and putting stuff on whiteboards. I think, you know, there's a lot of advantages of why that helps me as a designer and helps designers think through and work through stuff. But relevant to this conversation, it really helps facilitate those conversations. Developers, product owners, QAers, people are always walking by the boards, and they'll see something that sticks out to them, and they'll, you know, raise a question or will bring up a conversation, and I think it really helps sort of facilitate that and, you know, help, you know, bring up the conversation.
I'm a big believer in overlap, if you couldn't tell that already from my last couple of comments. And so I try to look for opportunities for my teams to overlap in their skills. One of the best ways to do that to start that I found is don't underestimate the power of food. I always take my teams out to lunch or to dinner and just eat together. And that's the way that we start projects is we go in the same spot and we eat together for an hour or 2 hours. And I mean, it's some of the best use of company money that you can actually you can have. You know, we're not gun shy about spending hundreds of dollars on software, but $100 to take everybody out to dinner is money well spent. So I start my teams out on our projects with, we go out to dinner, we go out to lunch, something together to just kind of build some camaraderie. And then as part of that meal, after everybody's done eating, we sort of go around the table and I ask everybody, what would you like to do on this project? And I also encourage the fact that it doesn't have to be to your discipline. It doesn't have to be in your silo of whatever discipline you're in. So just because you're a designer doesn't mean you have to do design work. And what I found is almost every time without fail, when you give people the permission to do that, they'll say something that's outside of their discipline. So we'll go around and I'll ask my designer, what do you want to do on this project? Well, I'd like to learn React. Cool. We'll go to the producer or the project manager. What do you want to do? I want to do the illustrations. And you get these sort of weird answers. I remember when we were working on redesigning Crayola.com, my producer said, I'd like to do the illustrations. And we all sort of chuckled at her. Oh, silly producer. Why are you going to do the illustrations? It turns out her undergrad was in illustration. And the producer of the project, even though we had an art director and 2 designers, the producer did all the illustrations for Crayola.com. And it was this interesting way that we kind of built overlap between the roles. Everybody started to do a little bit of everybody else's job. And so none of us were afraid to jump in for somebody else. Oh, you're short on this? Let me jump in. I don't know how to do the code on it, but I can write some JSON for you right now. Would that be helpful? And everybody feels the permission and the autonomy to sort of pitch in. And so building that overlap, I think, starts with food, but also you can very easily go into what do you want to do on the project and having people voice that, and then having the leadership on that team, their job really being to create the space for those people to do that and be able to remind them, hey, listen, I know that you said you want to do the illustrations. Why are you falling back on the product management right now? Let's create some space for you to do the illustrations. And so having somebody reinforce that is also a helpful tool too.
I want to jump back to the distributed teams for a second, because a lot of this, which I heartily agree with everything that's been said, but particularly when you're dealing with distributed teams where there isn't the luxury of being able to travel, it is a little bit more difficult to do some of these things. And just to give you some ideas, when I was at PayPal, I had 120 developers around the globe. I had folks in Singapore, China, India, one person in the UK, which is kind of just that one person, folks in Arizona, Utah, and San Jose, California. And when I first got there had been this pattern of the dev team getting together in San Jose, having meetings, recording them, and then sending out the recordings to all the other teams to just like listen to, you know, as a group, like offline. And then they could email questions, but of course, no questions ever came back. In fact, there was never really any confirmation that people had ever watched the videos. And so I wanted to actually have live face-to-face interactions. And so I took it upon myself to start, after we did those recorded meetings, first I would have the same meeting, you know, time shifted to whatever team I was planning to talk to. So I would stay up late or get in super early and, you know, try to do it that way. And that helped a little bit. But when I had the opportunity to travel around and actually meet every single team, I got the feedback of like, yeah, we feel really left out and this is hard. We don't feel like we have a voice. We're just being told what to do. And I was like, that's obviously very bad. And instead what we did was we decided that there would be no meeting that any geographic area couldn't attend. And this became very difficult from a planning perspective. But we made it work. So we needed to have at least 3 representatives from any team that was larger than 10 people in order to consider us to have, representation. And we held the meetings, we just time shifted them to suit one location each time. So it was ideal for one team to all be there, but then you had representatives from all the other locations. And we also tried to do these particularly around holidays or other events where we could share. So for example, during Diwali, that was the India team's opportunity to lead the meeting, and they had given every other team a shopping list. And so we had gone out and like decorated the meeting room, and we had ordered food, and folks came in, you know, dressed up. And so we had like a celebration at the same time, and we got to kind of share culturally, even though we couldn't all be in one room together, it gave us some additional ways of connecting. And we found that that actually created a much stronger bond and gave people other things to talk about. So when it came time to, you know, say to somebody else, like, hey, we need to talk about this workflow, or can we review this design, or I have some feedback on your code, there was more to it than just diving straight into it. It was like, hey, you know, I really wanted to say I like, you know, that presentation that you gave, or, you know, I'm really glad we had the chance to chat about this other thing, or I learned more about your family or your background, whatever it was. It just, you know, gave people more of a common understanding, which really helped. All right, so that's what devs, designers can do, hopefully on their own, or team members can do. I want to talk about what executives, whether that's the product owner, managers, people managers, team managers, or actual execs, do to help or hurt team strength.
Is the rule that I start because I have the mic?
Sure.
Okay. Jeez. Wait, I'm going to go to you, Steve, next, and then, all right. We're going to conspire. What do executives do and leadership do to help or to hurt? I read this great book called Turn the Ship Around. It's by David Marquet, and he's a Navy captain. And he has something like the most amount of subordinates that have been promoted to Navy captain ever. So I think most Navy captains have 1 or 2 that get promoted. He's got 17 or 18 or something like that. And so part of the book is about his leadership technique. And one of the things that really stuck with me about that book is that he said, in order to be a successful leader, you have to move authority to where the knowledge is. And typical org charts are not structured that way, right? Typical org charts are whoever's at the top has the authority, whoever has the knowledge is at the bottom. And so the people that are making the decisions don't have the knowledge about it, and the people that have the knowledge don't have the authority to make decisions. So for him, what he did was, you know, typical Navy, I'm going to do a poor job paraphrasing, but I think the idea is still there. Typical Navy rhetoric was, you say, sir, requesting permission to whatever, submerge the ship, and then your captain has to give you permission to submerge the ship. So he changed the vocabulary there. He said, we're no longer going to request permission. I need you to state your intentions. So instead, they say, sir, I intend to submerge the ship. And all he has to do is say, okay, or no, I have a better idea. And that small thing changed the way that they all work, because now you have to intend to do something. You can't just wait for someone to give you permission to do something. And so I find that whenever I'm like either coaching an executive or working with an executive team or a leader on my own teams, I try to think about, do I have the knowledge, even if I have the authority as a person running the project, do I have the knowledge to be able to make this decision? And if not, how can I move that authority to the person that has the knowledge or the people that have the knowledge? And I think more often than not, leadership has the authority and not the knowledge, and yet they decide things anyway. So I think that one thing that's been really effective for me and what I've seen is if you can move that authority to the people that have the knowledge, you actually can get better things done.
So kind of along the same lines, I guess, where I've seen things kind of work well is when there's trust not only across the organization, but kind of top down. So where managers trust the product owners to be able to decide, you know, what kind of features are coming in next and things like that, and where product owners trust the team to actually implement those things, and the team being the designers to come up with a good design. The designers trust the developers to communicate with them and get their ideas and say what's feasible, what's not feasible, maybe come up with some alternatives that they may have seen in practice. So for me, the whole thing revolves around trust. If you don't have that trust, then that's where everything starts to break down, and it's like, well, here's your design, do this. Here's the feature we're doing. Here's the design that we're, recommending or that we want. And here, it's kind of like the tablets coming down from the mountain, so to speak. So that's kind of the way I see it.
Fire people. Seriously, like there are so many teams I've been on where there's been that one, or depending on the size of the team, sometimes there's multiple people. Even if they're good producers, that's even worse. You know, somebody that does a good job at their job, but they also, you know, I spoke about poisoning the well earlier. I think Dan even said something about make sure you have good talent or something along those lines. So, you know, the other side of that coin is hire good people. Great products don't come from crap teams. You know, if your talent pool is shallow, you're not going to make a good product. End of story. So if there's somebody on your team, if there's any leaders here, if there's somebody on your team that you're on the fence about, well, that's a sign that you probably need to get rid of that person. And I've seen it before too, where it's taken way too long, years sometimes, and that person is gone, and then look at the look on everybody else's face the next day, you know, when that person's not there. It can have a profound motivating or morale effect, getting rid of somebody. And the other side is, you know, you got to hire good people. I think everybody pays lip service to that, and everybody says they want to hire the best people, but sometimes you really have to pay for good people. Yeah. Fire.
Well, so I will say there was one team that I worked with where the CTO was actually the problem, was that bad hire. And in that instance, all of the managers under that person had to become what I call, which I think the term came from Google originally, but they became shit umbrellas. Right? So a manager can either be a shit funnel, they just take what they're getting from above and they dump it down onto the people below them, and they're not very good managers, or they become, you know, the umbrellas, right? They're going to extend themselves over the team, protect the team from it, and they take all the shit. So sometimes those roles become very necessary in order to have a healthy and productive and functional team that creates a great product and user experience. So I've got basically one more question. We're just going to go straight down the line, and each person's going to talk about what they would like, what they'd like. Yeah, now the microphone's in the middle, so see, it all backfires. Each person's going to describe what they wish the role opposite them. So if they're a developer, they're going to say, here's what I wish a designer knew. The designer's going to say, here's what I wish a developer knew. And after that, we're going to do some Q&A. So if you've had questions, thanks for patiently holding on to them, and I'll come around with the mic or start thinking up some questions. So, Pete, you get to go first. What do you want a developer to know?
So start with a designer in a room full of developers is what you're saying. I guess this isn't necessarily what I wish developers knew, because I know this is gonna sound pretty common sense, and I know developers know it, but maybe something that should be just thought about or lived more daily. And that's that if you have a good designer, and I'll caveat it with that because there's a lot of bad ones, but if you have a good designer, there's a lot of work that goes into, hopefully they're producing very simple products or interfaces or whatever it is you're working on. So, you know, just by that fact that it looks simple, it might seem like it's simple to produce. But I know, you know, myself, I will agonize for days over the placement of a button or design of an interaction. Should it be a swipe or should it be a drop-down menu? Things like that will agonize over for a very long period of time, go back and forth, talk to users, get everybody's opinion. And, you know, when we land on something, you know, most design decisions aren't black and white. Right? Most design decisions fall into a 40-60 sort of ratio, like 60% of, you know, me believes that this is the right answer. So that's what we're going to go with, and then we're going to test it, and if we hear different, we'll change it later. But it's easy for not just developers, but QA and anybody else involved to be on that 40% side. It's not black and white. Sometimes it's hard to pitch, but just know that if you have a good designer, there's a lot of really hard work that goes into it. But I'll just say the flip side of that, the onus is on the designer to back that up as well. I'm not saying don't ever question a designer. If you think they're doing something wrong, challenge them on it. And if it's a good designer, they'll have rationale. They'll be able to tell you the analysis that got them to that, and they'll be able to back up their decisions.
For me, the developers that I love working with are ones that are curious. It's so hard to work with a developer that's not curious, a developer that's like, I'll just sit around and I'll wait until later. The ones that are like, hey, what are you working on? Can I see? I have some ideas for that. Can we talk about this? Can we whiteboard it? I love that. That to me makes for much better design. And this is maybe an unpopular opinion for designers, but the Agile Manifesto says working software over comprehensive documentation. Developers are the ones making the product. It's not designers. Designers are making documentation for the product, but the developers are the ones that are actually making the software. So I think that all the time on the project, or as much time as you can have, should be devoted to making software, not making documentation for software. So I feel like developers really hold the key to making really good software. Designers help, UX people help, strategists help, but developers are the one working on the software. So I try to enable my developers to have as much as they can, and as much as they need to design that stuff, and I want that reciprocated too. I want a developer to be just really curious about, this is what I need in order to get this done. And oftentimes the dynamic is flipped. It's usually the designer going, let me make all the decisions about this, and then developer, you've got to build it. And I don't think that's a good dynamic on a project. I would rather have it be the other way around, with the developer saying, this is what I need to be able to make really good software. Designer, here's how you can help. I love that scenario.
Well, I'd like to tell Pete some suggestions, but he might fire me, so I won't really do that. No, I guess from a developer perspective, I guess what I appreciate, and I think what other developers appreciate when they work with design folks, is to have some input. So most developers, particularly I think in the mobile space, we tend to be power users of our devices. We understand the paradigms. We understand what we're always looking at apps, seeing how things work, looking at the goods and the bads. And in the past, I've worked with design people where they're just like, here it is, this is what it needs to look like. And then you're expected to implement that, whether it works or not for the given, and it could be Android or iOS, either way. Whether it works for that platform or not, the expectation is, this is the design you've been handed, do it. As opposed to working with designers who are more like, this is the feature that we're working on, I'm kind of looking at this. Or when I worked with Pete and he took over buildings filled with Post-its and things, that was really good because we could have open dialogues. He'd come over and say, hey, Steve, what do you think about this, this kind of a flow? And I could say, well, that works, or this, yeah, how hard would it be? That was our expression. That was on everything. So that kind of interaction really works well. Like I'll say designers, trust your developers to have valid input into the process.
And I'm just going to add on top of that, I think it's better when designers give developers some time with their designs or with whatever they're thinking about, to give developers an opportunity to come up with language to express their concerns rather than flashing it up on the screen. It's like, okay, what do you think? And the developer's heart starts like racing and you're like, no, because you see myriad things that could blow up, that's a performance concern that the browser just can't do, or that would be really difficult. And you don't have any ability to express all of those things in, 30 seconds or less. And so I think that's just sometimes having that time is what folks need in order to go off, think, formulate the words so that they can express themselves rationally and in a way that others in the room will hear them rather than just see them kind of become this ball of emotion in some cases.
That's a great point too, and the flip side of that is if you do have that and the developer in the room, they know they're not giving a lot of time. They know that this is their one opportunity to give feedback. They're just going to throw out all their feedback right there, which can seem, from the design point of view, can feel like an attack or something on the design. So if there's more breathing room there, it's better for both parties. That's a good point.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So we're going to start off with questions here.
So as a recovering asylum inmate who is now running a number of teams full of inmates who are not sure they want to leave the asylum, being a software engineer, I guess the question I have is a little different than I think the tone of. You guys have evidently worked by and large with some software engineers who really want to be involved, the curiosity you described, and are frustrated when they're not allowed to be involved.
Fire 'em.
My team is full of people who are definitely not that way. the hand-wringing we've been doing amongst my leadership, my team is that something that can be taught? Or, to Pete's point, do we need to fire some of the people that we have and replace them because it's something that can't be learned? We spent innumerable hours, study groups, time trying to train this product mindset and interactivity design concern and business domain interest into them, as opposed to just tell me what you want me to do so I can get in my editor. Is this something in your experience that a team of people who haven't been exposed to it, don't know how to use it, can learn how to do? Or is it something you just need to hire in, and if you haven't hired them, then you're not going to get it?
I guess I'll start since I have the mic. Yeah, I mean, it's, we paint this pretty picture of an ideal world where every developer is engaged and you're allowed to, or you have the leeway to fire any person who doesn't, fit your exact pretty mold. That's not real life. I mean, the bottom line is, if there's one or two people you could let go that you feel like are dragging them down the most, and then you can hire one or two that are really engaged, it really, just one or two changes can really change a dynamic of a team. But it's unrealistic to think that you're going to get every single person on the team, that's as engaged or as enthusiastic as you want them to be. There's going to be some people who are a little bit more 9-to-5er, but if you have a good balance and you have, the overall, shape of the team is engaged.
I think there's a couple of premises that I'd like to accept first, which may or may not be true. The first thing is that you've got the right people. So, if, and these guys talked about it as well. If you don't have the right people, that's a problem for any organization. So the one assumption is they are the right people to be there. The second assumption that I have is that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I believe that anybody can learn anything. I run an apprenticeship program where I teach people who don't know development or design how to start doing it, and watching that happen is magical. I have kids, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. Watching them learn is magical, so I believe anybody can learn anything, especially, software, tech, design, all that stuff. Compared to all the stuff in the world that you could be good at, it's fairly easy. Getting good at it, really good at it, is hard. So that's the other premise that I have. So given those two things, you've got the right people and you believe that they can learn anything. One of the unlocking questions that I often ask, and it's such a simple question, but people don't often ask it, is, what do you want to do? Right? Talk to your engineer. What would you like to do here? Some of them are going to say, you know what, I would just like to sit at my desk, receive instructions, and just build the crap out of that stuff. And that's great, because you don't have to mold them into, not everyone has to be a champion and engaged and moving the product forward, because if you had that, nothing would get done. You need some, there's this great article by Michael Lopp, who is a product manager at Apple, called Stables and Volatiles, and he says that the world of software doesn't exist without both, right? You can't have a team full of volatiles because you wouldn't get anything done, and you wouldn't have a team full of stables because then you wouldn't move anything forward. So that you've got to have both. And so the way that I feel like you get to that is you sit down with each person one-on-one. This is the job of a manager, and you ask them, what would you like to do here? What is your dream state here? The places that I've worked, yes, I've worked with really engaged engineers. I've also worked with really engaged designers, but also the other way too. The last place I worked, the last agency, the senior most design director, he was an individual contributor track. He was an IC track where he was like, I'm not going to meetings. I'm not talking to clients. I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm not going to be involved in the business or strategy. I want to sit in front of Photoshop and comp. And he was the best at it. And he didn't go to any meeting, and he's been there for 9 years, and he was the highest paid of everyone, but that was fine for him to not be a manager because that's what he wanted and that's what his skills were. And so not everybody's got to be the push it forward, make everything happen. Some people just want to sit at their desk and code or design, and that's okay for them. So I think that the other part of this is you don't have to mold them into these champions, but what I think you can do is encourage them and help them be their best self. So if they're going to sit in front of their desk and code all day, how can they do that better than they did yesterday? I think that's the job of a manager.
Yeah, I'm just going to add on top of that and say sometimes you do have to look at the organization and see what is actually suppressing people from developing an interest. So I can think of 3 different projects I've worked on where I kind of went in, and I could be a little bubbly and enthusiastic at times, and people can find that annoying, but I was just like, wow, this place is dead quiet. Nobody wants to do anything. People just want to do their jobs, leave. They don't ask questions. They don't, and in particular, they don't question when things are going wrong and they see it going wrong, like train wreck about to happen, and they're just sitting there quietly. And I was like, what's happening? And then finally somebody pulled me aside one day and they were just like, you should stop speaking up. I was like, why? They were like, you're going to get fired. And apparently the manager had this habit of firing people who questioned him. I had been brought in as a consultant. I was like, well, I don't care. Like, they could fire me. I'll just get put on another contract. Like, my job is not, my paycheck's not in jeopardy. And I think that's what I'm here to do, like, to ask questions and figure out what's going on. So sometimes there are things in the organization that can just, after time, place enough weight on people that they're like, that's it, I'm checking out, and I just don't care. And they just stick around because they're like, it's easy. I can stick around because nobody's forcing me to confront why I just sit here and don't do anything differently.
Can I take a quick poll? How many people have had a manager that's asked you, what would you like to do here? How many people, of those of you, how many have seen that as a good experience? Anybody see that as a bad experience?
Well, I had one bad experience with it.
Yeah, one, okay.
Yeah.
Wrong answer.
Yeah, I did get that.
No, that's split right down the middle of the room, just about.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's a thing that, this is an impressive room because of that, but I think not enough managers are just say, what would you like to, how would you like to contribute? Because you're given a job description when you start there and you're expected to do that, but rarely are you given the opportunity to actually say, here's the way that I would like to contribute based on what I like to do, based on my skill set, based on what I'm really good at. And I feel like the more we open those opportunities, the better teams get.
Yeah, so my thought on this whole thing is, there's different types of developers, right? Some developers just do like to heads down and code, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's developers that are more interested in the product, the business, other aspects that go into producing whatever you're producing. So I think you really need a mix of those people. So I think a whole team of the people probably isn't the best, but if you have one or two that are more interested in the product and the evolution of the product and the user experience and all that, that's going to make your team a better team. I don't think there's anything wrong with the heads down type. I know Pete wants to fire them all, but.
But it sounds like some of these folks aren't the heads down type. They're the sort of disconnected, indifferent type.
There's a particular dynamic in my team. There's a particular dynamic in my team, and I don't know if it's related to this, but it is our current theory, which is, unfortunately, all of my developer staff are contractors. None of them are FTEs, so there's nobody who's got a career aspiration except, there's actually one, I say. And it's an enormous group. There's 92 people who are 85% contractors. And the FTEs are all the managers and the other people. And I don't know if that creates a dynamic that we can't fix. We've been told that there's no reason necessarily that because you're a contractor or an FTE that you can't adopt a product mindset. I mean, plenty of people choose to be consultants, as many of you are, or have been. But it's a concern. We're trying to figure out, how do we crack this nut? Yeah. How do we get the ratio we want? We know we want a ratio, but we know the ratio is not what we want now.
Right. So to me, if most of your people are consultants or contractors, you probably don't have enough of the right ones. Yeah. Because I know, we're a consulting firm, and I think one of the things that we bring to the table is that we do care about a product. Whatever client we're working for, we care about that product. We want that product to succeed, and we want it to be a good user experience and a good performing product. So I don't think consultants are the issue. It's probably the right consultants is what you need.
Yeah, and the other thing too is don't forget, we're talking about product mindset, but then there's also user mindset. So who's also thinking about the end user? And I'm sorry, I don't know who had their hand up first. Okay.
Thank you. I want to add to your points to answer your question, because people don't ask questions. Another important reason I've seen is coming from a different cultural background. It's considered to be disrespectful to ask questions coming from I know how my family is, but I started feeling more comfortable when I had a couple of team members who were coming from a diverse background who started speaking, and then I thought, okay, I can start talking, I can ask questions, and then, enrolling. Now, I encourage more diversity when I hire people for my team. Also, I try to make them give presentations, talk about it, and then you can see a huge difference that I have noticed personally. Thank you.
Comments?
I just want to ask a different question, if I may.
No.
I'm fired. But I don't really work here. All right, so the mix is not necessarily dev versus designer. Maybe it's like sales versus the both. But how do you balance MVP, speed to market, it just needs to be a beta, get something out because I sold this, versus pixel perfect, feature rich, minimum awesome product, high functionality?
So how do you balance it?
How do you balance MVP versus something that's awesome?
I think we kind of talked about something like this in our prep call, and it hasn't come up yet, so
We did?
we'll see.
So I'm not a design guy, so I'll just give you from a developer perspective. I think they have different goals, right? I don't think there is pixel perfect. I don't think that exists. But I think for a minimal viable product, that's what you're trying to get out. Very simple functionality. Don't overly complicate the product. Get it in the user's hands. Get feedback, whether you incorporate analytics into whatever you're building or some channel for the users to feedback information about how they're using it, what features they're using, and then you start to build more and more features and kind of release on a regular basis. I think that gets you a better overall experience and uptake with a product rather than trying to get everything done, release it, and then maybe in 6 months or a year we'll have another release with some new features. Does that help at all? You'll probably something better and fire you too.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a really tricky question, right? Because can be any kind of product or service, can be any size company, and they're all going to have a different tolerance for what they can put out in the market, MVP-wise or whatever. If you're working for a small startup and you don't have any skin in the game, you're not going to lose your company because you don't have a company yet. It's really easy to put something very simple out there. And just test, it's got 2 features and you're testing those features and you're learning from users and you build the next thing or enhance those features. It gets a little bit tricky when you're working with bigger companies. The last few contracts that I've consulted for have been very large companies and they have these very big, huge, long roadmaps. Right at the moment, we're trying to transform this smaller company inside of AT&T to be a much more agile company and trying to release an MVP, but we also have struggles because the product that we're producing has a hardware component, and it's very hard to MVP a piece of hardware that's got to have a certain amount of antennas in it and a certain amount of RAM and whatever to support the things we're going to do 18 months from now. So I know I'm not really giving you a very good answer to the question, but the balance is it comes down to having a good product vision and then being very realistic with what you can release with as early as possible. And then just, it's a very constant conversation that we designers have to have, at least in the organizations that I've worked with the stakeholders and the management and the leadership, is you hear a lot of buzz in the industry about this, Agile and lean UX and MVPs and all that type of stuff, and you see it a lot in the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the design progressive areas. But when you're working in the larger corporate America, it's still a lot of buzz, and it's still a constant struggle to get those kinds of things to happen. That said, I love it. It's a huge challenge, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
I gave you absolutely no good takeaway information you can go do. I guess I'm fired. You can't fire.
Yeah, you can't fire. I'll fire you. You're fired. So an MVP is designed to test a thing, right? It's designed, a good MVP helps you answer a question, at least one question. So one of the things that I see with a lot of teams is they don't even know what that question is. They don't even have that question. They're just like, the MVP to them is some subset of features, but they have no idea why. So I think the first thing is like write the question down. What is the thing that we want to know? And put it on a big banner and tape it up to the wall wherever the product team sees it. And at any point during your cycle, you can look at the product that you're making and you go, I think we have enough to answer that question at least. And that question could be, will people pay for it? The question could be, will people use this? The question could be, will people click that button? You know, and so any good MVP is designed to answer a question. So I think that question's got to be visible. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is that you've kind of like a product team has to get a feel for when is it a good time to release a new thing. And part of a thing that you could do as a forcing function is you can vary your cycle length. So you can say, you know, a lot of teams just default to 2-week sprints. Well, if you default to 2-week sprints, then every 2-week sprint is a release cycle, right? And you don't know if 1 week would have been better, or 3 weeks would have been better, or 4 weeks would have been better. So one of the things that I try to encourage is pick an experimentation time, so maybe it's a month, and in that month, release something after a week, then release something after 2 weeks, then release something after 3, even though the timelines don't line up that way. And then you'll get a sense of like, well, when we spent 3 weeks on it, it felt like a little bit too much. But when we spent 1 week, it actually felt like it was too short. So it'll give you a better sense of that. The GitHub team does that a lot. They have a saying in their product teams, and they say it's that time. So at any point when they're working on something, somebody can look at a comp or look at a prototype or look at something and go, yeah, it's that time, and then they ship it. And as soon as it's that time, as soon as one person says, I think it's that time, then they ship it. And if it's wrong, they'll figure that out, and then they'll re-release it. So I think that time is important for every product team to have that time, however you get to that. And then the last thing is how you decide what to put in your product and how you decide what to MVP. I tend to think of it in terms of urgency. So what is urgent right now? Is it urgent that we release something to fix a bug that exists, right? That's maybe really urgent. Is it urgent because a bunch of people have asked for this feature? Is it urgent because we're just really excited, right? That's a valid way to release as well. You know, we really want to get this in the world because it's going to boost morale here and it's going to help recruitment. You know, those are all valid reasons too. So I think that at any point you could examine your urgency on a team and you can go, what's the thing that feels most urgent to do right now? Do we have to fix something? Do we have to release something new? Do we have to create excitement? Do we have to, you know, whatever is urgent at that time, you can shift your release cycle to focus on that urgency. Hope that helps.
All right, cool. Next question.
Hi, so I think Pete mentioned earlier about not doing too much upfront design. And we've talked a lot about how agile teams are working at iterations. What kinds of things are the designers doing during those iterations as opposed to when development and when testing is happening?
So we're kind of getting on we haven't done anything official yet or anything, but I'm sort of working on getting our teams on a dual track Agile, where we're doing, you know, the one track is doing the design for the sprint that's ahead, you know, the next sprint, and we're doing review of what's currently done in the sprint, you know, what's currently being done and built by the developers daily, reviewing that. But then we have the other track, which is looking, you know, 2 sprints ahead, 4 sprints ahead. Sometimes we have to look even farther ahead because, you know, we're dealing with that 18-month timeline thing. But that's how we typically work it now. We have some designers focused on the 1 sprint ahead features, you know, what's in the backlog, and working with the developers to tweak and enhance what they're working on, and then another track that's working on the things to come farther out. I'd like to get it to a point where we're not even going, you know, that much farther out, but again, that's kind of based on how the business runs and how the roadmap is served to us.
One thing that engineers are really good at, that designers suck at, is that engineers can chunk work up way better than designers. Engineers can say, I have a big feature set I need to build, but here's a small piece where I can write one method or one function that gets me along. Designers aren't good at that, and it's not because you can't do it, it's just because they don't have the habit of doing that. So whenever I'm coaching designers on a product team, I'll try to get them to work smaller, right? So designers tend to default to a page. I'm going to design the products page. Well, you don't need to design the products page. Design something smaller. How about the header on the products page? Okay, that's smaller. What's even smaller than that? The search box on the products page, on the search box in the header on the products page? Absolutely. And if you can chunk it up into half an hour's worth of work, 2 hours worth of work, then you can get that over to someone. All right, I started on the search box, check this out, and you can get an engineer working on that while the designer works on something else, and you get this nice flow between the two. And so I've got some teams of designers and developers that don't know how to do that, and so they work in like day-long increments, which is really long. I've got other teams where I have a team spun up right now where my art director, he's working in like 15-minute chunks. He's like, oh, I bang this out, here's a button. I bang this out, here's this, and I put it together. And he's like sending things over every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, every 30 minutes. And so they've got this kind of nice cycle going, and what we're realizing is that there's a lot of stuff that as a designer works on it and sends it to the developer works on it but also improves it and then shows it back to the designer, and the designer goes, oh great, I don't have to design that anymore because you've already done that work. And so they're sort of building off of each other's work, and I think that comes from really chunking up into as small increments as possible. Designers just aren't in the habit of doing that, so if pairing with an engineer can kind of help them see like how an engineer can kind of chunk up a piece of work, that'll help the designer go, oh, the equivalent for me is maybe it's a component, or maybe it's an element, or maybe it's, you know, maybe I can splice it up a little bit smaller so that we can be working at the same pace. And that's often why designers don't fit into agile processes, because designers are like, well, I got to design the page, or I got to design the, you know, a 4-screen flow, and an engineer is like, well, I'm working on a 2-hour chunk, so I don't know how we could work together. So what generally tends to happen is designers go waterfall, and then when it gets to build, then it goes agile. But for designers to fit in that flow, if they can work on chunks, now they're working like the rest of the team.
All right, we're out of time. We're all fired. You guys going to be around for questions, further questions? All right, we'll stick around for a bit. Thanks, everybody, for being here.